Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 10:15, so I'm going to call the forum to order. Welcome to DNR's central office. Hello, everybody online. Thanks for joining in. Today, we have our MnSTAC forum presented by Dan Comerford with the Three Rivers Parks District. Dan has spoken at one of our tree inspector workshops a while back about the applied oak wilt management that they're doing in Three Rivers, and I thought it's sort of a timely topic as we're coming into oak wilt season. So Dan, I'm going to throw it over to you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, it is timely. I think last time I checked, we're about 30 growing degree days away. So yeah, with that hot week, it all of a sudden just shrunk. We have some land clearing projects going on where they're dealing with some oaks as we speak. So it's kind of last minute stuff. We have them painting stumps just to be on the cautious side. Well, Ryan, thanks for inviting me out here. My name is Dan Comerford. I'm the forestry specialist with Three Rivers Park District. I'm sorry, forestry supervisor. My background, I have a foot in two worlds. My first forestry job was actually in a sawmill in Western Massachusetts. I was a timber production silviculturalist for a while. I've moved out here. I fell in love with arboriculture. I'm a BCMA, and I get to do both here at Three Rivers. So half my time is managing shade trees, and half my time is managing woods issues. For those not familiar with the park districts, it's mostly suburban Hennepin County, about 28,000 acres. We have a little bit in Scott County, a little bit here in Ramsey County, and a little bit here right on the edge of Carver County. We're separated into two types of parks. We've got smaller regional parks closer to the metro that have more play structures and more amenities. And then at the fringe of the county, we have larger park reserves that are managed differently. We have an 80-20 policy where we're not allowed to develop more than 20% of the upland land area in those park reserves. Oak wilt is a problem in two of our park reserves, primarily Highland Park Reserve and Murphy Hanrahan. They happen to be the two parks that have the largest oak ecosystem. Most of our other parks, the forest areas, are maple basswood, kind of typical big woods, climax type forest. But at Murphy Hanrahan and Highland Lake, definitely a long history of being oak ecosystems. I'm not going to go into the details about oak wilt. I assume most people are familiar with it. It's a vascular invader similar to Dutch elm disease, insect vectored fungus. Not my graphic, but just a refresher of how the disease cycle, overland transmission with beetles, and then underground root graft transmission. Unmanaged, it can form infection centers, infection pockets that grow and expand outward. The more sandy the soil and the more pure oak stand it is, the worse the expansion. You can kind of see in the image here, dead trees, very dead trees, just dead trees, dying trees, and then some probably non-oaks stuck in there. So our goals in the park district, we have no hope of eradicating the fungus. We're in the metro area. It's been here for a very long time. And there is a lot of spore load from neighboring properties that we can't control. So even if we had complete sanitation in our property, it wouldn't quite be enough. Our parks aren't that large where they're immune from infection from off property. However, we can suppress or slow the spread, which is a noble goal. And of course, it depends on the definition of slowing the spread. It's always healthy to consider a do nothing approach. If we did nothing, we could expect that our infection pockets would keep expanding. It would perhaps be exponential. Certainly the individual pockets would be expanding through root graft, but we'd have a big increase in spore load and probably new overland pockets depending on storm events. However, there would be less mechanical disturbance to the ecosystem. Our control measures do affect the ecosystem, and we would save a lot of money. It's not cheap what we do. Just a very brief literature overview of some of the success in this region with plowing. It's gotten better over the years. Three Rivers Park District started aggressively dealing with oak wilt in 1976. We started with rental units. We've now owned 2 of our own vibratory plows, which I'll talk a little bit later, has kind of been crucial for our success. So I wanted to spend most of the time talking about our methods. I figured that would be most of interest to all of you. We start with an aerial survey. We still do it old fashioned with a helicopter. We use an R22 and we use a Trimble R2 receiver for good GPS coverage. We've thought about drones. Drones, I think, have a lot of application in more urban areas. We're limited in our larger forests by the line of sight requirements for drone operation. So I can only back up so far away from the tree line and still have eyes on a drone flying overhead. I think, quadcopter type drones have a lot of utility in urban areas just to see if there's the beginning of flagging trees in the upper canopy. In the larger forests, eventually I'd like to use fixed wing drones, but we just have to figure out a way to get around that line of sight problem. Some images of what we see from the air. These forests have had a lot of mortality over the years, so looking down, it is sometimes a grim picture. And then you have to I have to remind myself that trees normally die in a forest. It's not the end of the world. And I really have to kind of figure out what are new infections, what are old infections. After a aerial survey, then it's ground truth or ground confirmation. Sometimes it's extremely easy. If I get out in the woods or on a trail side and I see stuff like this, I barely have to look up. I can diagnose oak wilt by looking at my shoes usually. If I see a combination of red, bronzed, and green leaves that have prematurely been shed by the tree, often look up in the canopy and see something like this. However, we have a lot of other mortality agents in our forest. Two-line chestnut borer is a main one, especially over the past 2 years of drought. We're going to be seeing a lot more of this. So once I have a suspected oak wilt tree, I remove a little bit of the bark with a hatchet. And this is kind of an example of 3 stages. They all have a little bit of galleries. You can see kind of faint here. You can see the little bit of the galleries from two-line chestnut borer, but also how the sapwood is getting darker and darker. It's 3 separate trees. So I'm opening a window into the cambium to determine 2 things. One is I'm trying to figure out how much of this problem might be two-line chestnut borer, but I'm also trying to figure out how advanced the disease progression is in this tree and how dry the sapwood might be by the following spring. So I'm trying to make a determination if there are potential spore-producing trees. In my experience, that first one, I would consider a potential spore-producing tree. Even though it had galleries of two-line chestnut borer, it doesn't seem to be the primary agent of mortality. It seems to be secondary. A lot of these trees have a little bit of galleries, no matter how healthy they look. This middle tree is kind of questionable. I'd look at some other factors to try to rule out two-line chestnut borer. And this final tree, regardless of whether there was two-line chestnut borer, and there was a lot, in my opinion, it's infected early enough in the season that it won't have enough sapwood moisture to sustain spore mat production next spring.
Because of the two-line chestnut borer, you're saying that.
Not necessarily. I think probably because the tree was infected and wilted early enough in the season where it died early enough and still had enough of the growing season to dry down. Often if I look up and, we see something like this indicates two-line chestnut borer, often multi-year decline rather than just a month of decline. We certainly have trees that have oak wilt and two-line chestnut borer at the same time, which complicates things. Again, look for other evidence of the leaves. And then we start marking out the prescribed root graft disruption lines. I'll mark, if I determine it's a potential spore producing tree, it will eventually be cut down for sanitation removal, spore control, after we do the plowing. So I'll paint it and we mark our lines with kind of a complicated system of colored flagging. I often consult, there's various charts. This is a more recent one by the DNR, but there's a number of charts that are kind of based on the same Wisconsin model. A lot of it was developed in sandy soils in Wisconsin, so I'm a little less conservative than they are. I assume slightly less spread. And Murphy-Hanran, I should have mentioned, it's definitely like a ground moraine cobble type ecosystem, soil type. It's definitely on the loamy end rather than on the sandy end. And so we assume root graft shorter distances than it's in sandy soils. Originally, we developed maps, paper maps like this when I first started about 10 years ago. And these worked fairly well. but we've now moved on to digital systems, which just work fantastically. We're using field maps and Esri's software, where I can make a web map that guides our crews to what I need them to accomplish. This is an overview showing the trail network in Murphy-Hanrahan, and pink is access trails, and then the infection sites are indicated. And then when they zoom in, they start to see the prescribed lines. Our indication, we use blue for our primary, red for secondary. I'll go into a little more detail in a second about why we use multiple types of lines. This was our first vibratory plow that we owned. We operated this for 10 or 15 years up until about 5 years ago. It was a ditch witch. It performed pretty well. In our hilly terrain, the tired units aren't working. It has to be a tracked unit. We've now upgraded to this Caterpillar based vibratory plow with a brawn blade on the back. It has a lot of advantage. It's a stronger machine. There's also more hydraulic control of the vibratory plow. So rather than just up and down, we have the ability to angle it like this, angle it like that. The blade itself can move up and down in this housing. So it gives us a lot more flexibility. Sometimes when we come down hills and get into the flat, it can be really tricky if you got 5 foot of blade in the ground. Very brief video. This is in action. It's assisted by going downhill here. And the vibration, the hammering noise isn't really coming through in the audio. It's pretty deafening. It's definitely percussive, repetitive hammering. You can feel it in the ground. There's safety concerns. Even bystanders are wearing hard hats because it can shake things out of the trees. It's a lot of vibration. I had been saying root graft disruption. We have to be really careful because there's also forest floor disruption. I don't want to see that. I don't, first do no harm. I don't want to hack up the forest just to save one tree. This was a combination of not the best unit and also wet soil conditions. However, often we have plow lines like this with very little ground impact. We're really, in the past 5 years, we really tried to increase our work, clean, go procedures. We started noticing invasive species vectored from work site to work site. We first started noticing it with garlic mustard, but we started to get nervous about what else we could be moving around. Our highest priority is before trailering the unit and bringing it to other parks. We definitely don't want to bring invasives from park to park. The next frontier for us is controlling it within one single park and not bringing site to site. We have a pressure washer on the companion pickup that does a fairly good job, but it's difficult to get all the debris out of these units. And then the undercarriage of the dozer is very caked with mud. The next stage, sanitation. So once we've severed any root graft that we're concerned about, then we move into sanitation. We'll often use a log skidder, and so we're able to keep the machine on our hard trails, and we can run cables down the hill to our trees and bring them up with less impact. However, we also use skid steers with grapples, often forwarded on our gravel roads just with 1 ton dumps. For a while, we were immediately processing the firewood and then tarping piles of firewood, hoping that the splitting it would increase the drying, and then also adding on the tarp to be sure. Eventually, we just started tarping logs. We had mixed success with typical woven tarps. Definitely get fatigued, and they would often last only 1 season or 2, a couple $100 for a tarp this large. We rather than leaving the tarp in place all winter long, getting beaten on by the sun, we've actually delayed it. We tarp things first thing in the spring. It's kind of a risk right before oak season. But for instance, we just did our tarping last week. We've now moved on to vinyl tarps. We buy recycled billboard material. It's affordable and it's very strong and it's very patchable. We're having great success with it. We bring a 1 ton filled with sand, which is weighing down the edges to really exclude the beetles. Specific methods. This is one paper I'm highlighting when Jenny Duswick was working with us with my predecessor, Charlie Evanson. And basically it was investigating whether we'd have to do cut to line protocol or not. Cut to line would be installing your plow line, your root graft disruption, and then removing the infected host, but any potential host within that line as well. Just saying, you know what, let's just get this done and not have to come back. we're dealing with small enough acreage and areas where there's been oak wilt for so long, we felt that that might be a tad aggressive. We were interested in investigating kind of less heavy-handed methods. And so we've settled on what we call monitor and remove. This is a very, this is just very idealized. This is not that realistic. It's just to guide you through kind of what the differences between the two of cut to line versus monitor and remove. You may be familiar with some of the generations of different diagrams and prescriptions for placing your plow lines, whether it's just, you know, skipping a row of trees or something like this, which is referencing the Bruin model and being more specific. Here's an hypothetical example of a stand of red oaks and other species with an infected tree in the middle. 2013, we'll cut to line approach. We come in here, primary, basically using the chart, determine, you know, we've determined that it's highly unlikely this tree might be grafted, however likely this tree would. So that's where we place our lines, go in there, cut down the infected tree and the non-infected trees, one site entry, and hopefully you're done. Monitor and remove looks something like this. Same initial stand scenario. We come in here and using the same models, I've got the same primary line on the outside, but we'll also add a secondary line. You know, if this primary line was at like 95% confidence, maybe this might be at 80%. I'm not holding my breath for these trees, but I think they might have a chance. These ones I think are goners. I either think it's for sure already infected, or they are so close to this tree that any sort of mitigation with root graft disruption would be causing more harm than potentially saving the tree. It's hard having a foot in two worlds because in arboriculture, I'm trying to preserve every root. In construction, I'm trying to lock the contractors out of root zones. And then I turn around and I prescribe root destruction in the woods. It's hard. Example of, okay, so we remove just the infected tree, one site entry, and wait. But next year, just as we suspected, some of these trees in here, they already were infected. We didn't know it. They become infected. Come in, remove those. Now we've had two site entries with tracked equipment, with ground impacts. Another year goes by and yep, we lost another one here, but you know what? We also lost one here. Either incomplete root cutting or the roots also proliferate in that kind of tilled soil. It almost encourages them. Basically taking off the apical dominance of a lot of these roots, and then you'd expect them to proliferate in that tilled soil. That could be regrowth across the disruption line. That's 3 entries. Wait another year. Okay, another one died. At this point, it's been 3 or 4 years for this outer line. It's approaching the lifespan of that line. And if we didn't replow it, all of a sudden we'd have that, which would be a primary line failure. So monitor and remove, we have the potential of saving all these trees that would have been needlessly cut down. But the caveats are we've had multiple site entries with potential forest floor impact. And if we don't monitor it and we just walk away, in a couple of years, we could have primary line failure. So often if I'm seeing continued disease pressure and continued infected trees inside our lines after 4 years, I will often prescribe to replow that outer line to make sure things aren't moving towards a primary line failure. Unique challenges in human complications in a park district. It's a very hard message to get through to people, the risk of oak wilt and how little it takes to introduce oak wilt to a stand. This is Highland Park Reserve in Bloomington, and this beautifully engineered and constructed canopy viewing platform was installed. There's a couple aspen, but primarily it's right around it. It's a lot of small diameter red oak, but they're around, a little farther away is bigger red oaks. Beautiful concept. You were up in the trees. There was a view down to the lake down below. In the installation process in the summer, some limbs were pruned to accommodate the viewing platform. And I showed up later in the season and felled a wilted tree. This is the, let's see, if you can see this stump here, that would be this infected tree here. This was year 1 when I noticed the infection. Since then, that's dead, that's dead, these are dead, those are dead, that's dead, those are dead, those are dead, those 2 are dead. These ones remain for now. But the entire feel of this canopy walk is very different. Not so much of a canopy walk. Also at Highland in Bloomington, I was flying an aerial survey a couple years ago and found this huge new infection up in the air that really made me scared. It was an area of the forest we'd never seen oak wilt before. And I finally bushwhacked in and found a illegal treehouse by neighborhood kids. It's an awesome treehouse. It looked like a really fun treehouse, but 3 oaks got pruned at the wrong time of year and wilted. And so this is a complication that without human interference, we might not have had to deal with. Wanted to segue at the end. I know this is mostly an arboriculture audience, but like I said, I do a lot of ecological restoration and woods forestry. And I think there's a potential for the 2 disciplines to make progress against oak wilt. This is Murphy Hanrahan again. For those of you who haven't been down there, it's fantastic. It's kind of it's a mosaic of some restored prairie, intact oak forest, and then a whole lot of work in between that we've been doing to get things more on the canopy spectrum of woodland and savanna. You can see this is a leaf off image, all oaks. Everything underneath here is buckthorn, invasive shrub buckthorn. I'm sure we're all familiar with. It's been in this park for decades, and it's really entrenched. It's a severe problem. We're also dealing with an ecosystem that is kind of atypical. If you've heard Lee Freilich speak, for instance, talking about how some of these oak forests we're seeing are kind of a product of strange land use or coincidental land use, and it might not have been that normal to have these pure stands of red oak the way we see them. Just a couple other pictures of the type of buckthorn we're dealing with. I mean, it's hard to even get into the woods. So the forest-wide strategies here, we want to maintain an oak-dominated ecosystem. We're not interested in solving our oak wilt problems and our buckthorn problems by just shifting things to a maple basswood scenario or planting balsam fir in the understory. We have identified that we want to maintain oak-dominated ecosystem, especially in this region. It's close to the metro. It is one of the fewer larger oak woods left. We do want natural oak regeneration and then recruitment into the canopy. We're severely limited by the shade. Those of you who know silviculture, oaks don't often like to reproduce in their own shade. It takes special doing and increasing sunlight. And then we'd like to diversify the oak community. Right now, it's kind of, it's not purely heterogeneous. So we have definitely, the forest community is bur oak, white oak, red oak, and northern pin. But there's definitely monocultures of each. And I'd like it to be a little more diverse. We're also lacking much of an understory herbaceous community because of the buckthorn. If you're familiar with ecological classification system, this is probably the closest ecosystem to describe what we're dealing with down at Murphy Hanrahan. It's a fire dependent ecosystem, mostly oak. This is a general blueprint of what we're looking for. And then there is a lot, this is just a handful, but there's a lot of literature out there of management techniques to encourage savanna or woodland. For those of you not familiar, on the spectrum from open to forested, prairie on this end, closed canopy forest on this end, depending on who you are, you might subdivide it with savanna here and then maybe woodland until eventually forest. Our target community for some of these areas is in the woodland and savanna realm. This is a recent project we've done. This just last year. This is a new CPL grant, a 70-acre unit down in Murphy Hanrahan. First prescription was forestry mulching with a fecon mulcher. You can see the wall of buckthorn before the mulch afterwards. That's the unit we use. That's what is left on the ground. We also prescribed chemical girdling of non-oak trees in the mid-story and canopy. Wasn't a whole lot. Most of them were this large, like this elm, but there were a number of 10-inch elms, aspen. The one native understory tree other than oak that we retained was ironwood. Ironwood is doing a fantastic job of controlling buckthorn because of its shade, so we'd like to retain it. And then the final ingredient would be prescribed, I'm sorry, I don't have a slide showing it. This requires herbicide for the resprouts of buckthorn, but then also prescribed fire. For those of you who manage buckthorn, the easy part is cutting off the mature buckthorn. Then if you walk away, you're going to get 2 cohorts coming back. You're going to get vegetative resprouts that grow like a chia pet or corn, grows this tall in one season. And then you also have this cohort of the germinant seedlings, depending on how much sunlight you let in. Fire does not reliably control the resprouts in our experience at all. It can top kill it if it's thumb size or smaller. It will almost always resprout. Buckthorn seedlings, it definitely can take out an entire generation at once. It's incredibly effective if we can delay the fire until the germinates emerge. And just about when they're emerging is just when the fire season is, things are greening up and it's hard to get a burn. We've had a couple perfectly timed burns that really took out a whole lot of the seedlings. This is the way the unit is looking now. And I'd like to open it up to any questions. I might have gone a little fast, but I can certainly elaborate on anything, and forgive me for going too much into ecological restoration, but it's part of what we do. Yeah.
As humans, we know not to prune oaks during certain seasons, but we've got the woodland deer that go through and gnaw the trees off all the time. What kind of impact does that have to open up the young oaks? Is that been addressed or studied?
I'm not aware of many studies, and in my personal experience, the type of mechanical damage white-tailed deer would do, I mean, terminal bud browsing in the winter, I don't think, you know, by the time the flight season, the beetle comes around, that wound is no longer, so yeah, it's not going to attract the beetles. Rubbing would be kind of at the wrong season too. I mean, believe me, white-tailed deer are damaging this forest a lot, but not, in my opinion, not that way.
There's not an oak connection concern.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm much more concerned about humans and ice storms and hail and things like that.
You know, the last ice storm we had was just barely on the other side of the oak wilt cutoff for last days of human trimming. Okay. The one just recently? Yeah, the one we just had that tore so many trees down. Yep. I mean, most of the emergence models, I'm not worried yet. I think, you know, I think next week I'd be worried. Okay. Yeah.
Why is it that the oak wilt seems to be worse amongst the red oaks in sandy soil as opposed to more on soil?
Well, for the soil reasons, it's because the looser the soil, the faster the presumed root growth and the farther the presumed root grafting, so it can go greater distances. I think also in the sandy soils, you get a higher proportion of northern red oaks, which are slightly more, pin oaks, which are slightly more susceptible than reds. And then also just the red group in general, just with their, you know, lacking tyloses and really large early wood vessels, they just seem to get it really quick. I think we're fortunate that we're not in deep sand plains. It would just make, I mean, on the one hand, we might have more flat area, it might be easier to plow, but I think the rates of shred would be a lot faster. Yeah.
Yeah, curious, why are you tarping the wood rather than like chipping it, for example?
It's because the quantity of debris and utilization. We have campgrounds, so we like to use the firewood.
Got
I fully chipping, my understanding would mitigate the risk, the spore production risk, but it would just be a lot of chips, and we don't need that many chips actually. So yeah, we go through a lot of firewood at our campgrounds.
And maybe I missed this in the presentation. What size material are you getting it down to before you tarp?
I didn't mention it. We're going to about 5-inch. Although honestly, if they leave some 7-inch in the woods, the upper limbs, and if it's chopped up, I don't care as much. I really want the trunk wood. I really wonder what percentage of these trees really will eventually be potential spore producing trees. And I think that a lot of the damage being done to get every last bit of wood out there, we really have to weigh whether that's worth it. I'd much rather just get all the plowing done, make sure we're controlling the underground spread. That's, I would say, by far my highest priority.
Are you ever using chemical injection if it's close to a trail or something like that?
Nope. I take that back. We've injected propiconazole on a couple high value bur oaks in picnic grounds that are legacy or heritage trees that we really want to preserve. Often they also had bur oak blight, and we kind of thought maybe it'd be helping both diseases at once, but we've never used herbicides in the woods, either fungicides or herbicides to, like, kill trees intentionally. We haven't done that either.
So I'm not saying killing trees intentionally, but propiconazole you can inject surrounding trees.
Yep.
Is that something you've tried or?
Nope. We haven't, because we've had success with what we do. Is the primary reason. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, and also I love every one of these trees, but they're not as high value as a residential tree. Some of them are, but most of them aren't really, so.
Can we try to take a question from online? And it's Louise, and I think Louise is gonna try to unmute. Louise, you wanna give that a go?
Okay, I've unmuted.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Hello, greetings from blizzardy Duluth. My question is, Dan, have you had any interactions with trail building crews or trail building or trail maintenance workers, either volunteers or contractors, vis-a-vis how their activities are maybe unintentionally harming trees through spread of disease or insects? And if you have, how have you managed those communications to help them understand how to maybe do things differently?
We do have outside contractors work in our parks and woods. I think first and foremost, kind of administrative controls by, if at all possible, keeping people away from trees at all for April, May, and June. When that's not possible, for example, right now we have a large development project going on at the dam up in Brooklyn Park, where they're clearing a lot of trees. We have worked with our design folks to get our tree protection language into the specifications, both root protection zones, but also dates when they are allowed to harm trees, when they are not. And as I mentioned earlier, in this case, even though it's right before the flight season, there is an area where they're cutting down some red oaks, and we have said they need to paint the stumps within 15 minutes. For trail crews, I mean, we work with Conservation Corps of Minnesota, Iowa, but they work with us quite a bit, and so we're really able to talk with them at depth about oak protection. So I guess I'm mostly answering your question regarding oak wilt. For other disease problems, I mean, we have in our contractor specifications, we do have work, clean, go language specifying that they must clean their equipment before they arrive on our site and after they leave our site. And then we don't really have any interactions with people who would be bringing in, potentially infectious material or material of concern. I mean, we're worried about the general public bringing firewood to our campgrounds, but nothing with like trail crews. Does that answer it?
It does, yeah. Dan, would you be open to me contacting you after the webinar to maybe offer me some assistance?
Absolutely, yeah. I think is my contact information on the.
I don't think we've posted your email.
Okay. Yeah.
I can in the chat.
You can after. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Ryan will post that. And yeah, I'm more than happy to talk with anybody about what we do or brainstorm.
Well, thank you. And just for some context, I'm an arborist in the private sector with a strong forestry background.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So similar backgrounds.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I will mute myself now.
Your specifications publicly available.
I would assume so, but I have to ask. And if you want to email me, I'll have an answer and then I can share. I'm almost certain I could share them as a public entity, but I just have to double check.
As oak wilt's going through, are you seeing increases in other fungal pathogens like malaria, things like that put you up dead trees and spread even more?
I certainly see armillaria in our dead trees. I can see rhizomorphs colonizing most of them. It hasn't jumped out at me as like a primary agent of mortality. I think it's secondary. I hope I'm not mistaken. I don't see expanding pockets of mysterious death that is not oak wilt. So far, so good. I think with 2 years of drought and with prescribed root disturbance, I'm worried about two-line chestnut borer populations. I would say that's my higher priority or higher concern.
Maybe take another one from online here.
Sure.
Are there any white or bur oak trees in the park? Have they planted with white oak species?
We have plenty. So in Murphy Hannon, in our picnic grounds, we have a wide diversity. We have, we're really lucky, fortunate. We have our own native plant nursery up in Ryan, a lot about, where we propagate 30, 40, 50 native species. We propagate from seed, and for the most part, Hennepin County collected seed, although we're doing some assisted migration with some Iowa seedlings. So our picking grounds, I am fairly happy with the diversity. I mean, there's too many Acer in general, but I think a lot of people have that problem. In the forest, we're also lucky. It's a pretty diverse community. And I was focusing mostly on red oaks. We do occasionally get oaks in the white oak group with oak wilt. As you probably are aware, it's harder to diagnose. Maybe I rushed over the diagnosis portion. I know people working in the residential sphere probably would get laboratory confirmation before they prescribe expensive treatments. I don't necessarily have time for that. I often have 20 to 30 infection sites in a season. However, I have seen, oak wilt in the white oak groups. We sometimes plow for it. We never do sanitation because they don't produce spore mats. But I guess the takeaway is, yes, I mean, diversification is always high on our priority, and we're not actively replanting in the forest, but in the landscape, in the built landscape, we certainly are, and diversity is a key component.
Could you talk a little bit more about what kind of sanitation methods you use?
Mostly we just cut the tree down and get it under a tarp.
I'm thinking about the equipment afterward, power
Oh,
wash.
got it. Okay, so and to be clear, those measures aren't to mitigate oak wilt risk. It's more other factors we're worried about. Mostly spread of terrestrial invasive plants. And it's primarily pressure washing. I wish, sometimes I wish there was, if you remember, like in the 90s when they had mad cow disease in England, often they would drive over troughs of sanitizing liquid before you could, get to certain areas. It'd be fantastic if we could have something like that. I've yet to find something that is perfect. We're using a typical pressure washer in the woods. Back at the shop, we have a hot sea heated pressure washer with soap. That would be even more of a deep clean. Yeah, I guess that would be most sanitation. I mean, there's just as much risk about the Vibram soles of the crew out there. And so we're trying to use boot brushes when possible. Takes a lot of reminders, having work clean go posters around and just getting people to think about that.
Do you think your methods are very effective or somewhat effective in terms of sanitation?
For the invasive plants like I'm talking about, or for oak wilt?
Both for oak wilt and for invasive.
Oak wilt, I'm pretty happy with. We concentrate the infectious material in one area under a tarp. And if there was problems with that, I would expect to see a lot of new overland infections near there. And I rarely do. We do occasionally get holes in the tarps. Nothing's completely perfect. I think for sanitation, I'm fairly happy. I think there's no doubt that there's a lot of spore producing trees that we missed and are in the landscape or on private property. So there is a spore load out there. I think we meaningfully reduce it. And then for invasive plants, I think it's getting a lot better. I don't see I used to go out there and for the previous 2 years access of oak wilt sites, there would just be standing dead garlic mustard, silly, as far as you could see, just you'd almost follow that to the oak wilt. And we're seeing less of that. And certainly I am most happy with the cleaning between parks because we're able to just clean that unit. So especially once it's up on the flatbed, we can really clean everything off of it. It's time consuming and difficult to clean site to site. Other strategies would be, start in the most pristine areas and kind of work sites in the forest that get more and more invaded so that you're not risking bringing the invasion into the really clean areas. That sounds good on paper, but it's, when you're driving at 4 miles an hour with a bulldozer across a huge park and you're telling somebody to go way over here, then way over there and way over there, it gets back to balancing the impacts to our forest floor and the trail system with the equipment too.
Curious, so consider a remote hilly site with oak wilt removing 25, 30-inch trees. How are you getting those logs out of the woods to tarp them?
So honestly, a lot of our workforce is a T870 Bobcat that with its grapple, we're able to lift most butt logs of anything we cut down out there. The problem would be that unit moving through it's not designed as a logging unit. It's harder to avoid running. It's harder to avoid hitting retention trees. So that's why we've unearthed that old log skidder, which we've had since Dutch elm disease days, and it's been in storage. But just being able to really kind of go back to logging routes and use cables and winching them out of the woods seems to really minimize it. Keeping the tracks of the unit up on our hard surface trails seems to be the ticket. You know, we do, I mean, some of these slopes, I mean, we have some sites on, you know, pretty steep slopes that we can never plow up them. We have to design lines where people are plowing down, and for operator safety, I have a lot of lines, you know, like I get them just as side slope as I hope they might be able to, but I got to keep getting them facing downward. So it's a lot of these V's going downhill. But we have not had, you know, it's rare, you know, the occasion where we can't get the tree out. Occasionally it's a site that would be 300 yards into an area of the forest where we've never been before. We've never cut an 8-foot wide path in there. It's the only infected tree. There's a lot of ferns, there's ironwood, there's stuff I don't want to touch at all. There are situations where I say, I didn't see this, or let's not go in there, or we'll either not touch it or we'll cut it down and cut it into lots and lots of rounds, try to stack it. I don't think we're getting complete dry down, but it's probably helping, probably discouraging spore mat production or just minimizing it. Yeah, so I think there are examples where we leave some out there.
Can I go back to online quick? Question from Stefan. Have you used goats at all in the past to help with buckthorn control?
Park District has experimented with goats a handful of times. We are not using goats right now. I think it is a tool in the toolbox that has utility in very specific sites. In my personal opinion, it's a lawnmower that that doesn't take gasoline, but it's a brush clearing saw. But there's no herbicide, and I'm not saying everything should get herbicide. I'd like to minimize herbicide, but the unfortunate reality with buckthorn is I don't see a long-term solution without it. I think for some of our steepest sites where we couldn't get mechanical equipment up there, it might help. We've experimented using it kind of as like a secondary, like an indirect method of control by basically creating access to get into areas. I think where it has the most potential would be, in a hybrid situation where it's not just being used for invasive plants, but it's also if, for instance, we have an interpretive farm at Three Rivers Park District. If we were using our own goats and getting some sort of value-added product out of it, and there was interpretation, things like that, but it doesn't seem to have long-term control.
So with oak wilt not going anywhere soon, except I'm just curious about, are you trying to introduce other species like hickory and the like that might produce similar ecosystem services, i.e. nut-bearing trees, things like that?
We are not, because I agree with you that it's a native tree and it provides service. We are trying to think at the ecosystem scale and really not individual trees, but this, the whole fire dependent oak forest complex that we've identified really requires oak. And so I think the intermediate strategy I went into a little bit, which is, okay, maybe the reason oak wilt is such a big problem right now is because it's really thriving in these slightly artificially generated forests. And if we got to a situation where it was more diverse, even just among the oak species, but also more age diverse, and a more uneven age stand of red oaks would really help. I think a lot of the research has shown that root grafting is most common among kind of similar cohort trees. The spacing I talked about of getting trees farther apart helps us by reducing the incidence of root grafting, but it also helps us with our bigger ecosystem goals with getting more sunlight to the forest floor, developing more of a herbaceous community, getting more graminoid vegetation in there as well. So it's really kind of trying to zoom out and not think of just disease or just this, but no, not novel species.
So maybe we can close with one more question from online, and then folks in the room can chat on the way out. So we've got a question here from Dean. How far away do you locate the primary trench from an oak that is outside the isolation zone? I think maybe you were showing it with the chart.
Do you mean how far from the infected tree, or how?
From an oak that is outside the isolation zone. Oh.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming the question is, how do we determine like where to get that line? Like, when do we know we've gone far enough?
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, so my question is if, for the trees you want to preserve, how far away do you locate the primary trench from those trees?
Oh, so we don't inadvertently hurt them with root damage?
Right.
Got it. That's a good question. I don't think I have a really strong rule of thumb, other than, you know, it depends on how many sides of the tree I'm cutting. I certainly wouldn't get so close that it threatens structural stability. So often I'm 5 feet away at least. I'd like to be much farther away than that. Often it's kind of these tangential lines across one side of the potential root zone. But if all of a sudden I'm in a situation where, you know, in my hypothetical donut where we had, you know, a ring and another ring, and then all of a sudden I'm subdividing the rings like this, all of a sudden you start to wonder if you're doing more harm than good. I guess the short answer would be at least 5 feet away, but in a perfect world, we'd be following similar protocols to people in the residential realm of, you know, the fine roots are going way past the drip line. And presumably in the forest where they're not really constrained, they're going way past the drip line in multiple directions. So I don't think there's a strong rule of thumb there.
Okay.
However,
Thanks.
it's a 5 foot blade, and it is getting almost every single root. So it is pretty profound prescribed root damage.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dan, so much for going over the forum here, and thanks for being online, everybody. We'll see you soon.